humbled to be here in this panel and discuss this theme. We have four people that I will discuss with, and at the end of the discussion we will have time for some questions also from the audience. But let's take questions afterwards, if it's possible. If it's not, what you say, if it's not totally necessary, then you need to raise your hand and bring your voice in. So, four guests, and I realize I'm not sure how I pronounce your name, but I will try. Andriy Lyubka. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah, so you're a poet and a writer and a translator, right?
Yes.
From Ukraine.
That's me.
Yeah, that's it. And then we have you, Lisa Bjurvan. You are a journalist and a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome here.
Thank you.
And you also started publishing books about Ukraine as a theme.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
As the first theme.
As the first theme.
Yeah, an investigative reportage, Publishing House. Yeah.
And then we have you, Mikael Nydahl. You are a translator, mainly. And you're also one of the initiators for one of the books over there. It's, Under Ukrainas öppna himmel. That came last autumn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's... can you just say briefly what is it? It's a short...
Well, to put it technically, it's a collection of texts by Ukrainian authors, most of them written from inside the war, and it's a way to present these texts to the Swedish public.
And then we have you, Madeleine Grive. You're editor-in-chief for the literary magazine 20-tal, and also the organizer of this Stockholm Poetry Festival. And how many years have you been doing that?
97 was the first year, and we do it every year. It was inaugurated by Thomas Tranströmer, and we invite people from all over the world. And we have had a lot of Ukrainian authors during the years. 2004 we had Serbian Shadan, Halina Krok and Yuri Androkovich, and I found Serbian Shadan, then he was very young, and Halina Krok was also very young. I found them amazing, so they have come back many times to the festival and other events, and we also publish them many times in our magazine.
Okay, so Andrei, if I start with you, you have been writing several books and been translating to different languages in the Balkans, right? Is for a Swedish audience, could you say something about your work and your books? What are you writing about?
First of all, I was a poet. I started with poetry and wrote 3 books, 3 collections of poetry, and published them, received a few prizes for it. And then, at that time I was young. And then...
now you're old.
Yes. And then in a few years I switched to prose, and I wrote 3 books of short stories and 3 novels. From time to time I also write something between essays and columns, feuilletons. And since 2014 I am a professional writer in the sense that I live from my writings, but I'm also a translator from Serbian, Croatian fiction to Ukrainian. So it is my main occupation, but I think that it will be necessary to use this past tense in this statement, because everything was before the big war started. Now I'm not a writer, now I'm a volunteer. I put my writings and all my creative activities on a pause and dedicated myself to the volunteering work. And I think that, okay, I was a writer, now I'm a volunteer, but first of all, I'm Ukrainian, and as every Ukrainian in Ukraine, I'm a target. So I think that we have to understand that if you are Ukrainian, you live in Ukraine, someone wants to kill you, and you live with it, with this feeling. It is very important, and it is the very core, the very fundament of our life today.
Yeah, for many of us, the Russian invasion in February last year, even though it's been going on since 2014, it was like an existential shock for many of us. Not saying that it's been as hard as it's of course been a hell for Ukraine, but it's also been an existential shock for us as Europeans. And I wrote to you before this discussion that for me, I was born in '81, and my whole upbringing, everything seemed to get better in Europe. The Iron Curtain fell, Soviet Union collapsed, you could travel around in Europe. I discovered whole Central Europe and the Balkans 20 years ago. It was a fantastic experience, and I'm so glad that Europe was open and free. But then slowly, something has changed, and this events since February last year, my worldview crashed, and I'm still in a fog about the current state. Yeah, that's.
I think you are right, and before the new year, in late December, I had some kind of event together with my Polish friends from one famous magazine, Tygodnik Powszechny, and they had something like a club. It is a closed community with best readers, editors and authors, and they gather in mountains in some villa for a weekend, and it is something between seminar, because they read and they discuss some topic, and then they drink some wine and so on. So it is a very good combination to spend time. I enjoyed it a lot, and we had this closed event about the war in Ukraine, and we argued a lot about the very different stuff. So, okay, it is the war between democracy and autocracy, between democracy and tyranny and so on. It is also the war between small independent country, as we thought before, between weak country and big monster, big empire, yeah? As they used to say, the Second World Army and so on. It was also a nice joke. But I think that the topic itself is not so sincere, because we play with these words. We use these phrases that we are fighting for freedom, we are fighting for democracy, for our homeland and so on, but it is very pathetic and banal sentences. And what is the difference? When I arrived yesterday, it was a big pleasure for me to arrive to Stockholm, because you have a lot of electricity, a lot of lights, and everything is working, you don't have curfew and so on. It is a bit different reality from in which we live now. But it is also a different reality between me, Ukrainian from the western part of the country, between me as a volunteer who are visiting the front line but not fighting at the front line, and the soldiers who are fighting in the trenches. Because when we use these phrases, we are fighting, I'm not fighting. Yeah? We can, of course, we can say that we are fighting at the cultural front, and we want to bring some truth and I don't know, make Ukrainian voice, to be heard around the world. But people who are fighting in the trenches, actually, they don't fight for democracy or, I don't know, European future and so on. Because the war itself is about killing, is about blood, and is about instinct to kill the people you see at the very first second. And when we discussed it with this group of people in Poland, we discovered this fact that actually we use this possibility to sit in some warm place, enjoy the intellectual game in a way, and to speak about the war, but actually we don't know what war is in fact on the ground. And I thought, well, yeah, just to finish, at that time I thought that maybe this war is also between the past, which attacks us, between the past and newly formed ideas, everyday life, routine and so on, because this past, this imperialistic approach and so on, I hope that it is the very last phase of the agony of this past, but it tried to kill us. It tried to kill everything we really enjoy, and in what we really trust. Yeah, so you mentioned that you think that our future will be very nice because we are European and so on. And of course, war in Ukraine, Russian aggression brought new sense into this European idea, because when we received support from Spain, Sweden or Scotland, for example, from Great Britain, yeah, it's because people there realized that they are Europeans and that we have the war here in Europe.
Yeah, European Union is good at uniting under a crisis. That's usually when we stick together in European Union. Otherwise, we're fighting each other. Let's move to the theme for this discussion. It's about narrating the unspeakable, and in a way, you have already started this topic, Andrei, with your. But from your point of view, Lisa, as a journalist, what's your take on narrating the unspeakable, like putting words to about wars and atrocities?
Yeah, it's easier as a Swedish person, obviously, because you can take an outsider perspective. I would also say there's a huge difference between being a journalist and an author, and I was going to say just being an author, but you know what I mean. This is your job as a journalist. I mean, many of us who are covering this war, different angles of it, have written, like me in the past, about political extremism, human trafficking, rape, any kind of horrible topics, and basically you're in a work mode, and although you're affected by it, it's not like you can't do your job. So what you produce it's completely different producing like a journalistic work where you do in-depth interviews that I've done in my book here with women and exploring women's different roles. Whereas, for example, if you would write a fiction work about it, and of course as well, if you're Ukrainian and you are reporting from the front, it's literally your own countrymen and women dying. So both having a journalistic perspective and as a foreigner, it's much easier. But then as a publisher, I'm also publishing Stanislav Assayev's book, The Torture Camp on Paradise Street, Helvetet på Paradisgatan, which is an expose of Russian torture camps in eastern Ukraine. And that's something completely different, not least because he has lived it. He was incarcerated for almost 2.5 years, almost 1,000 days. So then it becomes personal in a whole different matter, and that kind of literature is more comparable to Imre Kertész and this kind of witness literature that we saw during and after the Second World War.
But I mean, not all journalists are traveling to Ukraine and
no, but they should be.
So yeah, but what brought you there? Was it just a job, or more of a personal just decision to just I will go there and start to?
Yeah, for me it was, I went for the first time a couple of weeks after the invasion began, because I knew, having written about women a lot in the past and crimes against women, I knew that there were two main risks here. The first was wartime rape, which is used as a weapon during war against women and also the general civilian population. And the second big risk was for human trafficking. And we've seen horrific examples of both. So I knew I was going to go down there and do reportage and articles on it, and just realized that the rest of the European media, now I'm just generalizing wildly, of course there are great examples as well, but as a whole, the Western media use women as a kind of touchy-feely edge to their articles. Like we say, like it's a journalistic sob story, not really delving in depth into this. And also, like, I mean, the majority of the war is seen with male glasses, right? And the more macho the reportage is, the bigger it's going to get, the more words the editor is going to give you to work with. So someone having their legs and arms blown up at the front is always going to take prominence to a story about a woman suffering from PTSD from seeing her neighbor being raped, for example. And this is where books come in. This is where literature comes in from a journalistic perspective. When media fail to give the whole picture, to provide an in-depth story about what's going on, reportage books can play a really important role in that.
Andrei, you said that you are a writer, but now you're a volunteer. So, is it? What's your take on literating the unspeakable? Is it pointless or not the right thing to do during wartime, or what
I think that the answer should be very personal for each writer, because, for example, for me it is impossible to focus. I start my day with WhatsApp. I open my smartphone and I'm looking for the chats, and I see my friends who are in the army or people from military units we helped before, and we have some chats before, and I just check that, okay, he was online today or yesterday, so it means that he's alive. I don't disturb him, don't write anything, but I start my day with this. And I think that after this experience every morning, it is quite hard to focus and to produce something. Probably the topic of this event would be very nice when we speak about the war in Bosnia, in Yugoslavia, but when you are inside the event, when you are at the core of the event, it is really hard in psychological and very personal way to focus and to produce something. Maybe it is very simple metaphor, but when your house is on fire, it is impossible to sit inside the room and to write a novel about the fire, yeah? Because in 1 second you can die. So you have to focus on this in order to survive. You have to focus on very different stuff, and I think that we will write about this experience after the war. And I really love this example about Milan Kundera, who wrote a brilliant novel about the Prague Spring after 12 years after the events. Yeah? So, because you need to be emotionally cold to the events when you want to write something. But I mentioned before that I was a poet. I wrote my last poem 10 years ago, and I thought that it is already finished page for me. But I think that in this time I discovered this feeling that poetry is a queen of the war. Because poetry is a very natural way to express yourselves, your thoughts, your emotions. And from time to time I write poems in my head. And it was the beginning of the March. We had the anniversary of our cult poet Taras Shevchenko, father of the nation, and so on. And I started to look for some of his poems in order to publish, to post it on Facebook because of the anniversary and so on. And I started to read and I finished the book because it was so powerful for me. And now when I have really small time for reading, for this intellectual kind of stuff and so on, poetry is a very good medicine for me, because even when I see some poetry published on Facebook, which was written today, for example, it is very hot material, and you see that, okay, it is a mistake, and probably you have to edit this or that, but this type of literature helps you. It is in psychological, psychotherapeutic maybe way. You help yourself when you write something, and it is very strange because it helps more when you write by hand. So this feeling when you write by hand and you see these letters here, yeah, it is some kind of magic. And I think that probably now we have to we can produce good poetry, and it is quite impossible to write a good novel, deep novel about the war, but after the war it is possible.
I have to just say quickly, what you're saying is like an echo of Halina Kruk that Madeleine mentioned, that I met in Lviv this autumn. So she's writing shorter war poems, and she's saying exactly the same thing. It's impossible to focus, and that it also, she said, it feels like a sort of betrayal to be, expanding your thoughts into this beautiful fictionalized. She has to write about what's happening that she almost becomes like a patriotic poet. And that's interesting, given this excellent collection.
Yeah, let's move to you, Mikael, and your work as a translator, and also the book that you helped give birth to.
It is. I mean, you and I have the thing in common that we work mainly with poetry. I mean, we like literature, but poetry is kind of central. And for me, becoming a literary activist was... I never meant to become an activist. I started off as a literary translator, as a poetry translator. And only when things started to deteriorate in this area, and my main language is Russia, so I have been following the return of the evil past in Russian culture very closely. Only then I gradually understood that I cannot be just a translator, I have to do activism. And activism means to partake in questions concerning the freedom of speech, human rights, etc. And also telling about what is going on to the Swedish audience, because we found that those of us who deal with poetry, we see a lot of things about the cultural and mental states that isn't visible even if you follow what is being reported in the news. So we just try to find forms to, bring poets in contact with one another and bring, you could call it information, but it's actually something else we deal with.
Yeah.
Now,
feelings or emotions, or
I'll get back to it.
Yeah.
When things started to happen in Belarus, the summer of 2020, something very important happened in Swedish literary community. There was a kind of consolidation of those who had been in contact with Belarus, occasionally or systematically. They formed a milieu in Swedish cultural, what do you call it, offentlighet, public sphere, that was actually engaged. And in this system, it turned out that the poets were crucial. And this was kind of a surprise, because you, in a situation of political and cultural crisis, you wouldn't expect poets to be the ones who channel knowledge, activism, etc. Now, when the invasion, the full-scale invasion happened in Ukraine a year ago, the same people reacted. I'm talking about Sweden. It was the same, spontaneously organized system of translators, of literary activists, editors, publishers. And what we did was reaching out to, some of us already had Ukrainian colleagues and friends. Some of us didn't have many of them, but they were on the radar. We had seen them engage also in the Belarusian events. And for me personally, the first weeks after the invasion, which I also received as perceived of as an existential shock for us. My first weeks consisted very much of reaching out to the poets I knew from before, or the poets that I just knew were there, asking, where are you? Are you alive? And how can we help? And immediately we started to receive not only, in best case we could reach people, in best case we could get some answers. I'm sitting here, I'm fine. Or I'm sitting here, I'm not fine, but I'm trying to get out. But we also immediately started to receive poems that were written with the house on fire. And those were good poems. It wasn't a kind of, they were good poems. And those poems were very, very important for me personally, but also for me as, I think, a function in this exchange of understanding, of feeling, etc. Because there is this, many of the Ukrainian poets I've been talking to for the last year say the same thing with different words, but they say that the language of war is one thing and the language of peace is another thing, and that they are very different. And I think that is true. But what happens when you get a good poem is that this is a piece of language that can be accessible both from the war, from the language of war, but also in some way, for me, living in peace and talking in the language of peace. So I found out that this kind of unexpected activity, dealing with poetry when the world is on fire, was the very, very most the most effective way to try to get close to the experiences that are being made now in Ukraine. And that this is when we do this, we create possibilities. I like to think of it in that way. We create possibilities for us, not only to witness and taking part of information about what is happening in Ukraine, but we get a small opportunity to partake in it. We can be inside the poem. This experience can reach us, and that creates a much deeper engagement.
Yeah, that's a good experience you're telling about. Do you have any comments on that, Andrei, or you, Madeleine?
The big hero in Ukraine, for many people, is Serbian who said in a full-packed church 2014, when we were there with magazine. We've been there 2013 also, and it was a big difference in the atmosphere. 2013 it was a great party at the council, and everyone was very happy and looking for the future. We were searching for literature to publish in an issue. We were going to introduce 25 authors for the magazine, and then we were back 2014, and people, you know, they have no look in their eyes. Everything was grey, and then Shadan stand in the church, a military church in the middle of Lviv, and it was maybe 1,000 people in there, and he said, in the opposite of Bertolt Brecht, that he said, now it's no time for poetry. He said, now it's time for poetry. And people really, really like that. And he's amazing going around having poetry readings for the army and the concerts. He's also a musician, a rock musician. And it's very important with the poetry and music. And of course there are many, many others. For me, it's, I think when you are, when you're an editor, you have the literary activism or journalist. I mean, you must have a purpose with what you are doing. And as editor in chief of a magazine, I have the opportunity to provide writers with a platform for expression, and by gathering different voices and different modes of portraying an experience, poetry or prose, essays, visual arts, in a single magazine issue, the different voices speak together in a way that brings the experience of war closer to the reader. And there is a need of many ways to speak about the unspeakable. A person not directly experiencing a war cannot truly understand what people are going through, but the arts can make us understand the plight and everyday suffering of other humans in a way that moves beyond news readers and statistics. Together they establish a way of portraying that which is close to impossible to truly portray through fragments of the horrible reality of what really war is. Art can make it more intimate. And for me, when my interest started for Ukrainian literature, I didn't really think only about the literature, because I found a very interesting literature, and it was unknown in Sweden, and so it was so much to discover. And it started for 18 years ago, and we had published a lot of Ukrainian. We made this issue, and in this big issue from 2014, we had a very well-known now essay by Oksana Sabushko. It's very many times quoted. She says, "If only the world could listen this time." It's a great appeal by her, and it's written specially for our magazine, published 2014. And it was an introduction, and she tells about the country oppressed and forgotten by the rest of the world. And it was vulnerable to cultural non-existence without a secure place in a global literary canon. A country where the people have been forced to stay silent to survive. Now, Sabushki writes, the people have finally realized all of the things that they need to tell the world. Today's Ukrainian literature struggles to put into words the most crucial subject imaginable, the reality of war, Sabushko writes. As you know, she's one of the greatest authors in not only in Ukraine, Central Europe, also in Europe.
And still is. Yeah, if I can, I just want to add that, yeah, I think that it is very important because when Madeleine contacted me it was the beginning of March, and as you mentioned that you also wrote a few messages to ask how are you?
Yes, yes.
Maybe it is much more important that, you know, that the fact of the publishing of the text, translation and so on, but these links between people are very important, and I think that it is some kind of currency. Yeah, when you receive from someone this simple question, it means that you know, this person thinks about you. And what is important? When we went here for the first time. I came to Sweden 8 years ago for the Stockholm International Poetry Festival, and then we had readings and festivals in Ukraine, and invited some Swedish poets to Chernivtsi, Kyiv and Poltava, and it was wonderful times there. And what we established links between people. And I think that when you read news about bombing of Ukrainian cities and so on, you can imagine you see the face of your friend, of the person you met. And in a way, this war, this so-called crisis or conflict, became also very personal for you. And it is a magic of literature, because literature is about reading, and it is very solitude process. You are alone when you read, yeah, you're enjoying the text, and in a way you establish the link between you and the author, and as your friend, or maybe as your counterpart in some discussion or talk and so on. And I was mistaken when I said that I'm not a writer now. Maybe I'm a writer, but in different way, because my volunteers' work is focusing actually on this writer's work. Because now I'm collecting money and buying jeeps for the army, and I receive this money from my readers, from the people who read my books, who visited my readings at some festivals, discussions and so on. So we established some kind of trust. I think that in March I will reach the point of $500,000 I raised on my Facebook account as a poet and writer, yeah? And it is a huge sum for Ukraine. For me it was unbelievable. 1 year ago I bought 120 jeeps with this money, and it is possible only because of this writer's background, only because of this link between the text writer and the reader. You can build trust. And I think that from this angle, of course, literature is really important now.
Mikael, please.
Yeah, I would just like to pick up the thread from you, Andrei, saying that I've been thinking a lot I mean during the last few years, about what is actually happening when you start to translate and when you start to publish and read one another. You should, perhaps you already know, but when the big invasion happened a year ago, we had, I think, 3 novels published, translated and published from the Ukrainian.
Yes, that's right. Before 2022, there were only 3 very interesting novels published.
We had 2 books by Serhiy Zhadan and 1 book by Oksana Zabushko, which was published almost 20 years ago.
Yes.
So, and I mean, your activities is the big exception, because you have been working with the Ukrainian, I mean, poets, etc., regularly. But effectively, Ukraine was a white spot on our literary and mental map. And I really think, in a very concrete manner, that if we had been reading, I mean your literature, continuously, beginning in the late 90s and then going through the Orange Revolution and the Maidan and the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, we as a society would have reacted differently to things happening. Now we didn't have this contact. We didn't have those personal ties between, I mean, authors and translators and editors, etc. But we also lacked a kind of contact between your literary public sphere and our literary public sphere and the wider political sphere. And that made that our society was not capable to feel the pain of the war in Donbass, for example. And therefore we could neglect it. We could read about it in the papers and say, oh, that's bad, it's war, that's not good. But we didn't react feeling the pain. And that is really possible only in this landscape where we don't read what is being written.
But I mean, remember, the same is said, can be said for so many other European countries as well. I mean, and this has been a large cultural debate here in Sweden. The same is for German literature, for Italian literature. Italy has elected a female fascist as a leader, and we seem stunned here, but the same thing there. We would have the background. And it's a huge sign of like intellectual poverty, as we call it in Sweden, that we just are not interested in other countries, in other European countries' literature, apart from, of course, the massive ones like Anglo-Saxon, so from US and the United Kingdom. So I'd say what you're saying goes for the whole understanding of the European geopolitical landscape. Reading Polish literature would also give great clues to understanding Russia's actions and the rise of neoconservatism in Europe and so on. And it's horrible if it should take a war of aggression to change that. So I mean, it's good now for Ukrainian literature, but it shouldn't, that's not what it should take for us to start reading voices from outside of Sweden.
I agree with you as well, but and now it will come a lot of books this spring and this autumn. It will come a lot of novels from Ukraine. And one problem has also been that there were no people who could translate from Ukrainian. It was almost only one translator, and so she had to work a lot. And then we also work with Russian translators, but not very much. We wanted to have it directly from Ukrainian. So that's why it takes so long time to work with issues and to introduce the literature. So often it's Russian translators who introduce the few Ukrainian texts that we have in Sweden, and some Polish as well. But I would just like to say that one of the first thing I did was to also contact all my friends, and I think it was after 5 days, and I that I reached you and asked you to write an article because it was so many people who called me from theaters, from newspapers, and to publish some texts from this. It was from churches, people who wanted to do events, because it was the only text that existed in Sweden. So we had a lot of work. We had to drop everything we were doing, planning, and just, serve people with texts from, and give them address to people in Ukraine that we know. And then we were planning a reading only after 1 week at the Royal Dramatic Theatre, a very big thing, and we did it with Swedish pen. It was, and the Royal Dramatic Theatre, of course, so we used the text, and I asked Andrei to write something new, and he did. It was an article. It was what happened the last week, a very strong text, and I asked Nils Håkansson to translate it, and he did it over the night, so I could have it at the theater, and people, they really, it was so whole quiet in the salon, and everyone wanted that text, and I gave it to Dagens Nyheter, Daily News, so they could publish them, and they made a large thing of the article, and it's still very good. Yes.
I think that you mentioned the problem with this lack of translators. It is very important because we need translators, and I think that we let's not forget that in culture we cannot receive the immediate result. So I think that what we are doing now will result, will crop in some 10 years or maybe in generation. Maybe people who came here as refugees and went to schools or to the universities, they will have the Swedish language as their second language, and they will be the best and perfect translators, as we saw from this earlier Yugoslavian experience. Yeah? So maybe in 20 years we will receive the result of what we are doing now.
I can say that we are seeing the results of it already in an amazing manner. Because this question about translating is very interesting. It's a separate one, and I can perhaps come back to it later on. But one thing that happened immediately after the invasion was that those fleeing Ukraine who had one connection or another to Sweden, they obviously tended to end up here. And they now form a tremendous potential, and not only potential, they are already working as literary translators, doing work for theaters, doing work for magazines, for workshops. So we are already seeing the whole landscape being rewritten. And yes, in 10 or 20 years, the impact will be tremendous if we now do the right thing and I mean build infrastructure around them.
But you Mikael, mentioned before also that the main language you have been used as a translator is the Russian language, and that is also more complicated for you right now. You said that the Russian language is the language that you have been translating mainly from, and that is not as easy anymore to just to only translate in Russian, that you kind of have engaged, like in the book that you published, have been engaged trying to learn Ukrainian and Belarusian, right?
Yeah. I mean, working with the Russian language, and especially with Russian intellectuals and writers now is tremendously complicated. It is part of the crisis that is happening now, and that is also one specific topic. But what I'm doing as a translator and editor and literary activist is that I'm using the Russian language. I stand on it and I try to look into the Ukrainian language. I cannot do it on my own, but I can do it together with, for example, the poets that I'm working with, or with the people who had ended up in Sweden from Kiev or other towns. So I mean, I use it to get in contact with the Ukrainian language, and also I deal with the Belarusian language. And this is, I mean, a good thing with this crisis is that earlier very few translated from Ukrainian because very few had the competence. And we who didn't...
It happened to me as well.
Only water.
And we who didn't have that competence, we tended to keep off, because you shouldn't deal with what you don't have the competence to deal with. But after February 24th, it was so obvious that if I don't do it, though I don't have the competence, then who should? So we came into a situation where we kind of just stopped to reproduce the emptiness and started from with very different kinds of competencies. We started to walk into this area which had been empty up till now. And the funny thing is that, well, funny, it's natural, because when you do this, you reach out to those who see and you say, please help me. I can't manage this on my own. And the funny thing is that you, get access to those texts, and you get them published, you get them presented into Swedish, and almost as a byproduct, you build those ties. You engage in friendships, you get engaged, and all of a sudden you see this area of contact between the Ukrainian and the Swedish system grow exponentially.
Lisa, I would like to ask you, when you engaged in Ukrainian literature and Ukraine as a journalist, have you discovered new things, or new have your perspective on your work as a journalist or a publisher changed?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, maybe from two angles. I mean, I've discovered things about Ukraine that's been quite fascinating, delving into the history of the country. Because one of the questions I wanted to answer with my book was, how come Ukrainian women are so strong? How come the resilience is so great, the mental strength? Because that's not a given at all. If you look at surveys in Sweden, our försvarsvilja, as we call it, our will to defend is very low. It's a question of if we'd even be able to defend our borders, basically. So I wanted to figure out, where does the strength come from? Obviously, one part is today, your country's being invaded, your sovereignty is threatened, but what about before? So that was fascinating to look at, and sometimes also quite horrific, to look at things like intergenerational trauma in families where the grandmother may have been raped by Russian soldiers, and the mother today realizes there's now a threat for her teenage daughter to experience the same, and hurrying to get her out of the country, reacting much faster than we would, for example, in Sweden, because you have this memory, this trauma in your DNA. And also, as you said, where you and I are about the same age, we don't really remember what was going on during the Cold War, but that's another reason, of course. You have it in your family, the trauma of Soviet occupation, and then the Second World War. So all of these gave fantastic clues to understanding where this female strength come from, which really surprised me writing the book. because you don't necessarily think you're going to be in the midst of this, like I write in my book, this wave of female power within a war, rather of a kind of victimized womanhood. And certainly that's been the media image of women solely as victims in Russia's war against Ukraine. Whereas in truth, there's this whole perspective of the strength that I wanted to lift. So that was one thing. And the other thing was realizing how naive Sweden has been in our relationship towards Russia. For example, always speaking about the great brotherhood between Ukraine and Russia, and then interviewing Ukrainian women and men, for that part, in Ukraine and Poland, and literally all of them almost saying the same thing with just a small variety of words, that they are not our brother nation, they are our aggressor, they are our rapist, they are this imperial colonist, they are our historical aggressor. Poland is our brother nation. They are the ones standing, which I could see with my own eyes working from Poland. But that has been a narrative not just pushed in Russian propaganda, but actually spread like subconsciously by the Swedish media as well. So being, and that also shows, I think, if we get back to the main focus of this discussion, narrating the unspeakable, why it can be so good for outsiders to do this. Because while the Ukrainians are under siege and literally have to work as volunteers, defending on the front and so on, we can bring out these truths about what's going on the outside. We can be a voice for the Ukrainian in the midst of this war, while, as you said, while the house is on fire. We can step in, not as propaganda machines just repeating a Ukrainian narrative, but just the voice of the civilian population, the voice of the ordinary Ukrainian on the ground. And that's a huge responsibility. That's why I said in the beginning, yeah, why aren't more journalists there? The only thing we should be doing is going back and forth, basically.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the witness literature as well, and that's been literature I've been reading since a teenager, like Primo Levi, stories about the Holocaust, and also Viktor Frankl, Life Needs a Purpose, and also books like Svetlana Alexievich books. And for me it's been, and I've been thinking about those writers, and some of them wrote books just a couple of years after, and some of them kind of waited 30, 40 years until they published their great stories. I mean, there seemed to be something about the witness literature that is important, in the sense that it turns experiences, personal experience, that in a way could be journalism, but it turns out that it's literature in a different way, and it's much stronger, I think, in the way it's put forward. I don't know how it's actually made, but it's stronger. I don't know if you have anything to say about this.
Well, Stanislav Asiev is coming to Kulturhuset, the main stage, on February 26th, so no one should miss it, because then he can tell you himself as a witness why he wrote it. But all I can say, what he writes in the foreword to his book that I'm publishing, is that the very thought of the book kept him alive in this Russian torture camp. And I think everyone who writes can understand that. Not fully, you haven't experienced it, but you know, when you have something so hugely important to say, you know you are the witness to this. If you don't get this word out, literally more people will die. The same as war correspondents do. Some of them have risked their lives and lost limbs now in Russia's war against Ukraine. So even before he had written a single word on it, that book was there, and it was what kept him alive. So of course witness literature is hugely important, and I would say the sooner it gets out, the better. This was published in Ukraine in December 2020, in English this fall, and now in January in Swedish. So this is relatively recent work.
Yeah, yeah, it's a strong book. I needed to just pause myself after just 10-15 minutes. It was like, take it in small bites, because it's such a hard experience. Yeah, it's such a hard experience. Yeah.
I would like to add that this witness literature, or maybe even media covering reportages and so on, are very important, because if you put it in a very cynical way, we live in democracies, and we have to pay attention about these opinions of the people, of the majority of the people, because they go to vote, and only after the elections we can receive some decisions and support. And that is why it is very important when we have foreign journalists in Ukraine who write not about statistics that 20,000 people were raped or killed, but write about a person, Natalia, Oksana, about her story, about her family, and after the emotional power of this coverage is much more fruitful for work with this public opinion in different countries. And I think that now it is really important, and probably that is why also such events like this we have here is also important, because usually people don't like politicians, don't trust them, yeah? But when you see someone, I don't know, artist, painter, singer, or poet, and when he can tell you his own story, not something from the news and you know, but very private story, it changes something. And I think that this cultural diplomacy, how we call it, yeah, actually it works like this, when we use culture as a tool to build this tie, link between us.
And that's very true, and you can read a lot about the Gulag archipelago, for example. I'm a historian, but if you read Solzhenitsyn, The Day in Ivan the Sonich life, you will understand the Gulag archipelago much more, and you have it into your soul, in your body, and it's so big difference. And that's what it's not journalism, it's even deeper when it's literature and the kind of that's deep art. It's a great work.
Yeah, and for me, reading Svetlana Alexievich, and before this talk, and I was also rereading it a bit, but it's, for me, it's also reading her work is also a way to getting into kind of the, I don't know if it's the right word, but the soul of the people, like the real the real human beings. She has some. She's saying something like, I'm not interested in wars. I'm interested in people, in the human during the war. That's what I'm fascinating about. That's what I would like to give voice to, and I think that's really true. And I think that's also what you mentioning with Mika.
Just one thought when we're talking about Svetlana Alexievich. The thing that she does almost in all her books, I mean the basic method, is that she goes home to people and sit in their kitchen and listen to how they tell their stories or their grandfather's stories. She's trying to find the history, the oral history of the Soviet experience. And that is always opposed to the official. She knows that there is a real story and it's being told and retold in the kitchens. And this is a thing that not all of the poets I have been working with during the last years, but more than one of those poets I have been in contact with have said that the war coming back to Ukraine on a full scale brings back, obviously, the trauma from the Second World War. And they talk about this, that those who went through the Second World War basically learned not to talk about it afterwards. There was this official heroic tellings of the victory, the Soviet victory, but there was very little place for the stories of personal trauma, for example. And they are talking about that when we write about personal trauma now, we provide a language for the generations that didn't have a language for it. So it's just a very interesting picture how the things that is happening now and that the poets, among others, are trying to give words to, how that activates the older traumas and the languages or the lack of language. Do you have anything to say on that, Andrea?
I recall the day of the 24th of February, 1 year ago. In 1 week we will mark the so-called anniversary of the beginning of the war. And I think that we as readers also have to recall time before it, because this war actually started as a war with fires, guns and bombings in February, but the real start for this full-scale invasion was done by publishing of a text by Vladimir Putin. Yeah? So he wrote a so-called historical essay on historical unity between Russia and Ukraine and so on. And the text itself, because the topic of our discussion is about this narration, and the text itself was the ground, yeah, for the invasion, because he showed his views, and this battle between different experiences and between propaganda, between different narrations, and also about this traumatic past, is at the very core of the war, and it is a tool which Russian propaganda used within the country, not only outside, but also within the country, in order to create this image of Ukrainian Nazis and so on. And they usually use in the Telegram channels, they usually use this word Germans, Nimцы, that not Ukrainians are fighting, but Germans, yeah, in order to recall this traumatic past. So yes, it is very important, but now when this invasion started, actually much more important is, what is going on the battlefield. Because if Kyiv or other regions of Ukraine will be occupied, after that we can write different essays and put different arguments into it. But the battlefield is crucial, and what we are doing now in this literature, and why it is important, yeah, because with this literature background, with our role and our links, we Ukrainian artists, writers and so on, we are going outside the country, and it's quite a hard process, because it is forbidden for males to leave Ukraine, for example. And yesterday when I crossed the border, I have a honor to be here, and I have a pleasure to be in Stockholm and so on, but I also have a shame, because when you are abroad, I saw at the border crossing point, there were a lot of women, more than 30 women in the line, and it was really strange, and they didn't know that, for example, I'm a writer who is going on to some event and to speak about Ukraine and so on. Yeah? probably they thought that I tried to run away from my country and so on. And it is, on personal level, it is very hard. But what we are actually doing, we are trying to bring out this thought that we need more weapons. It is very crucial, because without weapons, without the front line, and without this strong defense, we will not have opportunity to create essays, poetry, and so on and so on. So weapons and ammunition is actually the goal of cultural diplomacy now. Yes, it is strange, it is crazy, but without it, we don't have Ukraine, and without this support, which is very important now, not in few months, not in autumn, that we will receive aircrafts or tanks and so on. We really need it now, because without it we can lose the battle.
I'm sure you've all read Halina Kruk's speech at the Berlin Literary Festival last summer, where she speaks about the cruelty of Western pacifism and how Russian authors can allow themselves time to sit and delve into a higher purpose in their poetry and so on, whereas people are actually being physically slaughtered on the ground in Ukraine. And on this topic of narrating the unspeakable, I think I can really recommend that to everyone in the audience as well, because we can't pretend that there's not a divide between the intellectual Western Europe and what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, there is a tendency to take on a pro-peace, even pacifist perspective that's completely redundant in this situation. And there's also a tendency to portray Ukraine and Russia as somehow equal parts involved in a conflict, not a war of aggression. And that's something all of us here, active in the culture sector, not least as writers, have to deal with. But I think she really puts that moderator at that literary festival into place, where she says that war is not a metaphor. That's the title of it, right? So war is not a lofty literary metaphor. It's actually people being crushed under tanks. So she brings it down to the ground. So I really appreciate what you're saying about Ukraine needing more weapons, because if there is no Ukraine, we could be involved in this discussion forever, but there's no Ukraine to speak about anymore.
I'm a pacifist myself, but and that is strange, when a pacifist says that we need more weapons. But I like a thought by Krzysztof Cierzewski. He is the founder of Pogranicze Foundation, Borderlands Foundation, on the border between Poland and Lithuania, and he told me a few months ago that we writers have to pay attention to the words. And when we say about the possible victory of Ukraine, the sense of the word isn't correct, actually. So, like we import some other words from other languages, we have to speak about the Ukrainian word called peremoha, because this peremoha is some other concept. And it is very different from what we had before, because now it is not war between Serbians and Muslims and Croatians in Bosnia. It is not a civil war between pro-government and anti-government movements in Syria and so on. It is aggression of big empire on a relatively small and weak state. And usually for Central and Eastern Europe, we have this stereotype, romantic stereotype, that okay, they can organize uprising, and they are heroes, and they can die at the battlefield, and that's all. Yeah? And what changed now? That we have this feeling of peremoha, that actually democracy and small country can fight and defend itself. It is really the game-changing concept, because we see that actually values are important, and people can fight fight for democracy, for seeing the European integration and future and so on. So it is not only, you know, like topics for discussions in some Brussels halls and so on. Peremoa, it's something that returns us to the core of the European idea that we live in this united house, even if Ukraine is not a part of European Union, but it is Europe. Yeah? And we live here on this soil, and if we have this war in the neighborhood, it means that it can also come here.
Okay, I think it's time to open up for reflections or questions from the audience.
Like I said in the beginning, you take on a different perspective because it's almost like you are, I wouldn't say a parent, it's difficult to describe, but you are your professional you know, just like I am here on stage. When I'm playing with my kids and I pretend I'm an elephant, I don't sit like this. We are all different versions of ourselves. When I interview that woman, I listen, and I process, and I take it in, and I make sure to ask just a few proper, well-thought-out questions that put no burden on her whatsoever. And in the end, I might not even use it, because it could be, I've cut out so much from my book that's just, it's not worth exploiting. What helps me, both as a reader and as an author, is talking to the experts. So the Swedish politician Margot Wallström was the first one who got the UN role as an investigator on sexual violence used as a tool during the wars. So she's interviewed in my book. She explains why this weapon is so commonly used. It's cheap. It creates a huge amount of damage from only, you know, have to do that, only raping a few people, because it terrorizes a whole population. Even women in neighboring countries feel fear when they hear what's going on in Ukraine. So it's incredibly efficient, it doesn't cost anything, and it lowers the morale, and it damages the woman, her family, the village, and like I said, the entire nation. So hearing these explanations and how it's been used throughout history gives you some clue, and knowledge is often really good as a kind of comfort, because you're not left alone with your feelings of hatred like you speak of. Of course, what are these people? How can they be doing this? And the knowledge comes as the comfort of knowing men have been doing this all throughout history, but change is coming. And even just since the Balkan Wars, people were saying, oh, that's nothing. Let's bring the torture case here, and then we'll deal with the rapes later. No, today we know that rape equals mental and physical torture. You are entering a human being physically, but also violently entering their mind through the physical act of rape. You're basically trying to eradicate a whole person. So I can only speak from that perspective, that in my book, that context shines through. The reader will know what is being done, how far we've come to just in 10, 15 years, and that these people will be brought to court. And Ukraine brought the first Russian rapist to trial in the spring of 2022. It's not happening 20 years later now, it's happening during the invasion. So we as society, we are evolving, and we are learning what it means to rape women and children during war, and it's becoming more and more of a taboo, even within some parts of the Russian forces. So it's slowly becoming something that humanity is trying to eradicate. So I hope that offers some hope.
So I'm looking at you, Mikael or Madeleine. Do you know anything about classic Ukrainian literature? And will it be translated into Swedish?
No.
I must confess I have a knowledge gap.
Maybe.
I could say I think it is coming, and I think it will be made. The first translations will be made by the Ukrainians who now end up here, because they come with a love for their classics, and they want to show the classics to us. For the time being, people like me are we are very stuck in what is going on right now, for obvious reasons. But there is also a big problem with translating classics, and that is that they are often incomprehensible as classics outside their system. The Swedish classics, if you bring them to Ukraine, you would probably get applause because it's always pretty poems. But the fact that a work becomes a classic has to do with the cultural context. And in order to translate the classic, you must translate the context. And this is so hard because every now and then some translator or introducer makes a heroic effort and produces this translation of a classic from literature X. And we read it and we don't know why it's a classic. We don't know in what manner it changes its literature. So, I think we will get them. And that's a good thing, because when they start to appear, we get some kind of picture of what makes them the classic they are.
Yeah, but that's a good way to...
I think that it is a very good question, because when you want to understand something and when you want to understand the war and the roots of the war, usually it is very productive to read something not about the war. And if I will write some novel in the future about the war, it will be not about the war. Yeah? And now I'm one of the translators of Miljan Kojergovic, Croatian writer, into Ukrainian, and his novels are not about the war in Bosnia, for example, but in a way, when he describes some routine life and some personal stories of families and so on, you can understand why the war happened and what happened after this. And of course we have a lot of things to show, but you're right that we have something unspeakable, but also something untranslatable. Because if you translate Taras Shevchenko, the magic, disappeared. And we have very, very, very nice examples of modernism in poetry and from 100 years ago. I think that it could be interesting, and this cultural diplomacy and promoting Ukrainian art should be really, not conventional, because the biggest problem with the classic, but don't tell anyone, that it is boring. Yeah? And we have to find some books which are not only classics and important for Ukrainians, but which can be interesting for other cultures and readers.
Maybe that's also a problem with Swedish classic books sometimes. It's not obvious that people, how many young people are reading the classic Swedish literature nowadays? I don't know. Do we have more questions and reflections?
Thank you for your statement, because it was not a question. It is a sign that our event is okay, because if we have some, for me, so strange point of view, it is good for discussion. Yeah? It is very good for and productive for discussion. But I think that this point of view should be delivered, for example, for Russians, because we didn't start the war. And the war now is going on Ukrainian soil, yeah? And it is quite hard to have some conversations and with a rapist, for example. It is impossible.
Let's move on. But it's hard with peace movements during a war. Let's move on.
Hello, my name is Елизавета, I'm Ukrainian as well. My reflection is to Andrey's words that when your house is burning, you can't write novels or something else. But about my experience, I was born in Mariupol. It was one of the hottest spots in Ukraine, and one thing what I could do is writing, because I studied journalism, and it's like habits, you know, you should write if you feel something. And now I have a question which is connected with my experience. While our people is writing under bombs, when they're on shelters, when they try to write their thoughts about this, about fear, and people continue to read like great literature, Russian great literature, how we can break this, because people know about Dostoevsky, Lev Tolstoy, Pushkin, but they don't know Shevchenko, or and
Nikolai Gogol.
Yeah, even Lina Kostenko, just how we can break it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a knowledge gap in the Swedish society, so we don't know about these authors that you're mentioning. So that's one thing, and we talked before this seminar about the Iron Curtain, and I think that's also one way to understand how it's possible that we have so little knowledge about what was on the eastern part of Europe and in Central Europe. So that's, I mean, it's not, it's a shame that it's like this, and we need to do something about it.
It's a shame, but you know, we have to be honest. It is impossible to know everything about every country, and predict that in 20 years we will have a war in some country, and we, for example, in Albania, and now we are starting to read Albanian classics. Yeah? The fact that you are here is the sign that everything is okay, so you pay attention for it, and it is interesting for you. But usually it is a road with both sides move. Yeah? I think that cultural diplomacy works in both sides. It is impossible just receive 1 million euros and put a lot of ads here about Ukraine and Shevchenko, Lina Kostenko, and so on. I think what I experienced as a manager of different cultural events, that usually it is more productive to promote another culture in Ukraine, and you will receive something in return, because writers whom we invited to Ukraine and who visited Ukraine became our ambassadors, because they were in Ukraine and they know that these are regular, normal people, normal lives, they are not Nazis, and so on and so on. And they became, after that, they became ambassadors of Ukrainian culture. So when we translate someone and invited them to Ukraine, this writer sees the people of the country as his readers. It is some kind of this mental ownership. Yeah, oh, these are my readers and they are in danger. Yeah? And it is a very private but productive thing. And I have to say that we have one very good example of this regarding Sweden, because during the war, in Ukrainian publishing house was published a book about Sweden, and we have an author here, Yulia Rychukchi, is a historian, and she lives here and lived for more than 10 years, and she wrote a non-fiction book about Sweden. And it is a miracle that such kind of book can be published during the war, in the wartime Ukraine, but it is popular and it is interesting to discover something new. We also have this sin, not know everything about other countries, including Sweden. We know some stereotypes, and we have to fight with stereotypes and go deeply, and it is both side movement.
That's a good way to put it. The last question.
Well, my whole book is about Ukraine's women during the war. So I guess that answers the first part of the question. But I do agree, yes, there is an abstract level to the discussion, which is counterproductive. There are also some examples of books where the authors put themselves in focus, and it's about them traveling through Ukraine and them experience and how the war makes them feel, instead of listening to civilians, which I consider basically criminal as a journalist or an author to do that kind of work. So I hope more reportage and non-fiction will come out from the ground, where we really take up Ukrainians' voices. So, but yeah, so that's what my book is all about. Yeah.
Mikael?
And I listen to your question and I think about, I know what you talk about when you talk about that many intellectuals here stick to a pacifist agenda, which is kind of fine. They only should know that that kind of pacifism costs lives, and if they are fine with that, they could do it. But I was thinking about something else that struck me when engaging in this dialogue with the poets inside Ukraine or having already fled to some European country. And that is, and it has to do with the language of war and the language of peace as well. That I found that for me it was very hard to adapt my own language to the experiences I met in the texts. That I was very, I would like to stay in the language of peace, not having my language affected by the experiences of the Ukrainian poets and people in general. And at some point I understood that this is a thing I just have to deal with in my own way of choosing texts for presenting them. Because I saw that this text won't work in a Swedish context, because there is so much violence in it. There is hatred. There is, I mean, all of this various forms of trauma and violence that war consists of. And I decided that we must, exactly for this reason, those texts must be translated. And they must be presented, because they give us the possibility to understand what is going on, and bottom line is that for me is that we cannot continue to pretend that we live in peace. That we must find a way of understanding that this war going on makes us part of it. It is going on here, and that we have to adjust our own positions and our language and our ideologies in a way. I am also a pacifist.
And worldview in a way. Yeah.
What?
And use worldview.
Yeah. The only time I have been fetched by police and judged in a court was for refusing to join the Swedish army. But I am quite aware that what we should do now is sending weapons to Ukraine. That is pacifism.
Okay, it's been a long discussion. Thank you, Andrei. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Mikael. And thank you, Madeleine. And thank you for coming and listening. And a great applaud, I think, for the panel.